Hello my dear viewers, welcome to another episode of our channel. Today we're going to embark on a journey through time that will make you rethink all those romantic fantasies about living in a medieval castle or participating in jousting tournaments. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live in the Middle Ages? Perhaps you've watched series like Game of Thrones or Vikings and thought, it would be amazing to live in that era. But reality was quite different from fiction, especially for peasants, who represented about 90% of the medieval European population. Today, you're about to discover the harsh and raw reality of what it would be like to wake up in the shoes of a medieval peasant. And believe me when I say, you probably wouldn't last even 24 hours under these conditions. We'll explore everything, from the time you would wake up, well before sunrise, through the precarious food, non-existent hygiene conditions, exhausting work, to the dangers and diseases that could end your life at any moment. Why do I say you wouldn't last 24 hours? It's not just a provocation to get your attention. It's that we, people of the 21st century, are completely unprepared for the brutality of medieval life. Our tolerance for pain, discomfort, and hardship is infinitely lower than that of our ancestors. If you're curious to discover the details of this fascinating and terrifying reality, keep watching. And don't forget to like, share with friends, and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Let's begin. Before we throw you into the mud of a medieval village, we need to understand the historical setting in which you would be living. We're talking about European Middle Ages, a period that extended approximately from the 5th to the 15th century, beginning with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD and ending with the beginning of the Renaissance. For our mental exercise, let's place ourselves specifically in the 13th century, around 1250, in what would now be England or France, the heart of medieval Europe. This was a relatively stable period within the Middle Ages, known as the High Middle Ages, but no less challenging for common people. The 13th century was marked by significant population growth in Europe. It's estimated that the European population increased from 30 million in the year 1000 to about 80 million in 1300. This demographic growth put pressure on available resources and directly affected the lives of peasants. Medieval society was rigidly stratified, organized in what we call the feudal system. At the top of the social pyramid were nobles and clergy, who represented less than 10% of the population, but owned almost all land and wealth. At the base were the peasants, the overwhelming majority of the population, who lived in conditions of servitude, bound to the land, and obligated to deliver a large part of what they produced to their lords. The figure of the feudal lord was central to the peasant's life. This nobleman was the landowner and offered protection to the peasants in exchange for work and tributes. In practice, this meant that you, as a peasant, would have to work about 3 days a week on the lord's lands, the so-called corvée, labor, and still deliver between 30% and 50% of everything you produced on your own lands as payment. The 13th century was also marked by constant wars. France and England were frequently in conflict, and even periods of peace were punctuated by local disputes between nobles. For peasants, this meant that their fields could be devastated, their homes burned, and their sons recruited to fight in wars they didn't understand and from which they wouldn't benefit. The Catholic Church exercised immense power, controlling not only spiritual life, but also much of social, political, and even scientific life. The calendar was organized around religious festivities, and the church collected its own tax, the tithe, 10% of all production. Imagine having to give 10% of the little you managed to produce to an institution that was already immensely rich. It's important to understand that the medieval world was deeply superstitious. There was no scientific understanding of natural phenomena, diseases, or disasters. Everything was attributed to divine will or supernatural forces. If a storm destroyed your harvest, it was because God was punishing the community for its sins. If your child fell ill, it could be the work of the devil or a local witch. Climatically, the 13th century was in the middle of what historians call the medieval warm period, approximately 950–1250, followed by the Little Ice Age that began around 1300. Temperatures were generally milder than in previous centuries, which favoured agriculture, one of the few positive aspects for peasants of the time. Cities were small compared to current standards. London, one of the largest cities in Europe in 1250, had only about 40,000 inhabitants. Most people lived in small villages of 100 to 300 inhabitants. These communities were relatively isolated, with little communication with the outside world, except through travelling merchants, pilgrims, or officials of the feudal lord or church. The life expectancy of a medieval peasant was surprisingly low, around 30 years, and that's if you were lucky enough to survive childhood, since infant mortality was extremely high, with about 30% of children dying before the age of 5. This is the world you've just woken up in. Hierarchical, violent, superstitious, isolated, and brutally unequal. A world where your life is worth very little in the eyes of those who hold power. A world where hunger is a constant companion and where death can come at any moment, whether from disease, violence, or simply from the harshness of daily life. You wake up startled before the first ray of sunlight. It wasn't the rooster's crow that woke you, but the cutting cold that penetrates through the numerous cracks in your cabin's walls. It's summer, but nights are still cold in the countryside. You blink, trying to orient yourself in the almost total darkness. The smell is the first thing that hits your senses, a dense mixture of smoke, damp straw, earth, and animal excrement. Your bed is nothing more than a straw mattress spread on the packed earth floor, covered by a rustic wool fabric that terribly scratches your skin. Beside you, huddled together to conserve heat, sleep your supposed family members, your parents, perhaps 2 or 3 younger siblings, and possibly a grandfather or grandmother. The concept of privacy simply doesn't exist. In this world, you sit up and immediately feel your muscles ache. It's not just the discomfort of the improvised bed. It's the result of the exhausting work from the previous day, something your 21st century body simply isn't accustomed to. Your hands are calloused and cracked, with dirt so deeply embedded under your nails that it seems to be part of your skin. The cabin where you find yourself is small, with no more than 30 square meters to house the entire family, and, during winter, some animals as well. The walls are made of a wooden structure filled with a mixture of clay, straw, and manure, a technique called wattle and daub. The roof is covered with straw, which needs to be replaced frequently to prevent leaks. There are no glass windows, only small openings that can be covered with waxed cloth or wood to prevent wind from entering. In the center of the cabin is a rudimentary hearth, simply a space on the floor where fire is kept burning. There's no chimney. Smoke simply rises and finds its way out through the straw in the roof. which means the interior of the cabin is constantly smoky. Your eyes burn, and your throat is permanently irritated by this smoke. The furniture is practically non-existent, perhaps a rustic bench, an improvised table made of boards supported on trestles, some chests where the few belongings of the family are stored. The pots are made of clay or iron, extremely precious and passed down from generation to generation. As you get up, your bare feet feel the dampness of the floor. There is no floorboard. You walk directly on the earth. During rainy seasons, the interior of the cabin becomes partially muddy, a perfect environment for fleas and other parasites that infest both humans and animals. Leaving the cabin, you're faced with the village beginning to wake up. The sky is still dark, but there's already movement. Cabins similar to yours are arranged around a common space, where some sheep and goats graze freely. The smell is even more intense out here, a mixture of smoke from fireplaces, animal excrement, and the odor of rarely washed human bodies. The morning mist hangs over the fields surrounding the village. In the distance, you can make out the small church's bell tower, the only stone building in the community. Beyond that, on a hill, stands the feudal lord's castle, constantly reminding you who owns the land where you work. The sky begins to lighten, revealing a day that promises to be hot. In summer, this means working under the scorching sun. In winter, it means fighting against the relentless cold. There is no middle ground in medieval life. Around you, other peasants emerge from their cabins. Women are already lighting outdoor fires to prepare the first, and often only, substantial meal of the day. Small children run barefoot, their bellies visibly swollen, not from good nutrition, but from worms. Older men stretch, their bodies already bent by a lifetime of work in the fields. A distant bell rings, marking the beginning of the workday. You have a few minutes to prepare before heading to the fields. You already feel hungry, but know you'll have to wait until the meal is ready. Usually a simple porridge of oats or rye, perhaps with a piece of stale bread if you're lucky. This is your new world, and the day has barely begun. Survival in the Middle Ages as a peasant was a constant struggle against a series of daily challenges that we, modern people, can barely imagine. Let's explore some of these obstacles you would face in these first 24 hours. Your first great challenge would be food. Forget the idea of 3 balanced meals a day. A medieval peasant's diet was monotonous, deficient, and frequently insufficient. Your main meal would basically consist of a thick porridge made from oats or rye, called pottage, accompanied by dark, dense rye bread. Meat, perhaps a few times a year, on special festivities. Vegetables would basically be onions, turnips, cabbage and peas, grown in the small garden near the cabin. Bread deserves special attention because it was the basis of medieval nutrition. But don't think of the soft white bread you know. Peasant bread was made from inferior cereals like rye and barley, frequently contaminated with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations and can be fatal. The flour was coarsely ground and mixed, with all kinds of fillers in times of scarcity, husks, roots, even clay. The result was a hard, dark, and frequently bitter bread. Potable water would be another major problem. Springs and wells were frequently contaminated, especially near villages where there was no sewage system. The solution? Beer. Yes, even children drank weak beer with low alcohol content as their main source of hydration. The fermentation process killed most of the pathogens present in the water. Hygiene, or rather the lack of it, would be a shock to your modern standards. Complete baths were rare. perhaps a few times a year. The common belief was that water, especially hot water, opened the pores and allowed diseases to enter the body. You would limit yourself to occasionally washing your face and hands. The result? An intense body odor that would only not bother you because everyone smelled the same. Bathrooms as we know them didn't exist. For your needs, you would use a bucket inside the house, which would be emptied in the morning into a common ditch or directly into the fields as fertilizer. In larger villages, there were community latrines over pits or waterways. Toilet paper? Replace it with leaves, moss, straw, or if you were sophisticated, a reusable piece of cloth. Teeth? Without toothpaste or efficient brushes, decay would be a constant companion, as would bad breath. People tried to clean their teeth with rough cloths, chewed herbs, or twigs chewed at one end to form a kind of primitive brush. Toothache. The remedy could range from herbs to extraction without anesthesia. Work would be brutally demanding. During summer, you would work from sunrise to sunset, something like 16 hours a day. Work in the fields was done almost entirely with human and animal power, using rudimentary tools such as ox-drawn plows, sickles, and rakes. Your hands, accustomed to keyboards and touch screens, would be covered with painful blisters within hours. The clothes you would wear would be extremely uncomfortable. Made of rough wool or coarse linen, they would constantly irritate your skin. You would probably have only 2 pieces of clothing, one to wear and one to wash, rarely. In winter, the cold would be relentless, as the thermal insulation of these clothes was precarious. In summer, you would sweat profusely under the same heavy pieces. Sleep, which could be your only relief, would be interrupted by flea and lice-infested straw mattresses. You would scratch constantly, and the bites could easily become infected. Additionally, the cabin would be shared with the entire family without any privacy. Snoring, coughing, crying children, and occasionally the noise of rats and other small animals would ensure a restless night. If you got sick, which would be quite likely due to contaminated water, poor nutrition, and unsanitary conditions, there wouldn't be much to do. Medieval medicine was a mixture of superstition, religion, and limited herbal knowledge. For a simple fever, you might be bled, literally have your blood drained, to balance the humours of the body, a procedure that often further weakened the patient. These are just the basic challenges you would face in your first hours as a medieval peasant. And believe me, we haven't even gotten to the really difficult part yet. Let's now dive into some specific details of a medieval peasant's daily life that would make your survival for 24 hours a real challenge. Agricultural work, your main occupation, was brutally primitive compared to modern methods. Ploughing was done with a rudimentary wooden plough, often reinforced with a small iron tip, if the community could afford this luxury. This implement barely scratched the soil's surface, requiring multiple passes to prepare the land for planting. You would walk miles every day, just following the plough's trail. The cultivation system followed the 3-field rotation model. 1/3 of the lands was planted in autumn with rye or winter wheat. Another third was planted in spring with oats, barley, or legumes, and the remaining third lay fallow, resting, to recover fertility. This meant that, regardless of the total size of the land, only 2/3 were producing at any given time. Productivity was extremely low by current standards. For each seed planted, an average of only 3 or 4 grains were harvested, compared to ratios of 1 to 30 or more in modern agriculture. A bad harvest meant almost certain famine the following winter. Besides agriculture, there would be other essential tasks: cutting wood for fire, repairing tools and fences, caring for animals, usually some chickens, perhaps a goat or pig, and, if the family was more prosperous, a cow or an ox. Women, besides helping in the fields, would be responsible for spinning and weaving, making cheese and butter, preparing food, collecting medicinal herbs, and of course, caring for children. The medieval economy was based primarily on exchanges, with little circulation of coins among peasants. A day's work for a man was worth approximately 1.5 pennies, enough to buy about 3 kilos of bread. To contextualize, a workhorse would cost about 100 pennies, the equivalent of more than 2 months of continuous work. Taxes and obligations would be a constant burden. Besides working on the feudal lord's lands, corvée labour, you would pay the tithe to the church, 10% of all production; milling fee, about 1/16 of the grain taken to the mill; oven fee, to use the community oven to bake bread; tallage or census, paid to the feudal lord, varying from 10% to 50% of production; fees for life events, marriage, merchet, death, heriot, and inheritance transmission. Health would be a constant concern. The most common diseases included dysentery, known as bloody flux, caused by contaminated water malaria called marsh fever; endemic in wet areas ergotism, known as St. Anthony's fire, caused by the fungus that contaminated rye leprosy, which led to complete isolation of those affected tuberculosis; consumption, which killed slowly; and of course, the dreaded bubonic plague, which returned in devastating cycles. Available medical treatments would be primitive at best, lethal at worst. For fever, you might be bled with leeches. For pain, you would receive herbal potions with unpredictable effects. Wounds would be cauterized with hot iron. Broken bones, when treated, would be immobilized with rudimentary splints. Most diseases were attributed to humoral imbalances, sins, evil eye, or demonic possession. Available technology would be extremely limited. Tools were almost all made of wood, with small metal parts, extremely valuable. Lighting would come from tallow candles, animal fat, that produced smelly smoke, or from simple oil lamps. There were no mechanical clocks. Time was measured by the sun's movement, by church bells ringing, or by rudimentary hourglasses. Communication between villages was slow and inconsistent. News travelled only at the speed of people on foot, or rarely on horseback. Many peasants spent their entire lives without moving more than a few kilometers from their birthplace. Informational isolation was almost total. You wouldn't know what was happening beyond nearby villages unless merchants or pilgrims brought news. Illiteracy was practically universal among peasants. Documents were understood only by the local priest and perhaps some officials of the feudal lord. This left peasants vulnerable to abuses, as they could not read contracts or obligations imposed on them. These specific details of medieval daily life are not mere historical curiosities. They are concrete barriers that would prevent a modern person from surviving in that environment. Your body and mind, accustomed to the conveniences of the contemporary world, would find in this scenario an apparently insurmountable challenge. Beyond the daily and continuous challenges we've already discussed, your survival as a medieval peasant would be threatened by significant events that could occur at any moment. Let's explore some of these events that could make your 24 hours in the Middle Ages particularly memorable or fatal. Natural calamities were frequent and devastating. A severe storm could destroy the entire harvest in a matter of minutes, condemning the village to starvation in the following months. Flash floods ravaged cabins and drowned people and animals without warning, especially in areas near rivers. In the absence of weather prediction systems, these events seemed like manifestations of divine wrath. Fires represented a constant threat, with houses made of wood, straw, and clay built very close to each other, and with open fire being the only source of heat and light. A single spark was enough for entire villages to be reduced to ashes within hours. Without fire brigades or piped water systems, peasants formed lines to pass buckets of water from hand to hand, usually insufficient, to contain the flames. You could witness or be a victim of one of the frequent epidemics that plagued medieval Europe. Even before the Great Plague, Black Death, of 1347-1351, which killed about a third of the European population, localized outbreaks of diseases such as smallpox, dysentery, and influenza frequently decimated entire villages. Without understanding about contagion or basic hygiene, these diseases spread rapidly and were interpreted as divine punishment. Famine was a regular visitor. The so-called hunger month, usually April or May, when the previous year's stocks ran out and the new harvest had not yet arrived, was particularly dangerous. During prolonged periods of scarcity, people resorted to famine bread made, with ground tree bark, ferns, and even soil. There are records of people eating rats, insects, and, in extreme cases, there were even episodes of cannibalism during the worst medieval famines. Violence was an everyday reality. Bandits and deserting, soldiers formed groups that terrorized peasants, stealing supplies, animals, and occasionally kidnapping women. Even more dangerous were armies on the march. Even if there was no declared war in your region, troops passing through villages frequently requisitioned food, drink, and other resources without any compensation. Wars, even distant ones, directly affected peasants' lives. In the 13th century, during conflicts such as the Barons' War in England, 1215-1217, or Louis IX's campaigns in France, feudal lords increased taxes and forcibly recruited peasants. Entire villages could be razed as a war tactic to deny resources to the enemy, a strategy known as scorched earth. Medieval justice was quick, brutal, and often arbitrary. If you were accused of theft, for example, you might face a trial by ordeal, where you would have to hold a red-hot iron. If the wound became infected, which was almost guaranteed, you would be considered guilty and hanged. Women accused of witchcraft might be subjected to the water test, tied up and thrown into a lake. If they sank, they were innocent, but would probably drown. If they floated, they were considered witches and burned alive. Festivities, although moments of joy, could also be dangerous. Festivals such as May Day or the Harvest Festival often ended in violence when excessive alcohol consumption led to fights and accidents. Popular games like Village Rage, a kind of primitive football without clear rules, regularly resulted in broken bones and occasionally deaths. Religious persecutions were another danger. Movements considered heretical by the Church, such as the Cathars in southern France or the Lollards in England, were brutally repressed. In 1233, for example, Pope Gregory IX instituted the Inquisition to combat heresies, and entire communities suspected of harboring heretics could be massacred. As an example, a particularly cruel aspect of medieval life was how these events disproportionately affected the poorest. While nobility could take refuge in fortified castles during conflicts or epidemics, or simply move to their properties in unaffected regions, peasants remained bound to the land, facing the full impact of these calamities without any safety net. Any of these events could occur during your 24 hours as a medieval peasant, and any one of them would be enough to severely test your chances of survival. During your 24 hours as a medieval peasant, you would encounter various characters whose actions and decisions would directly shape your experience and chances of survival. Let's meet some of these individuals who would have power over your life. For better or worse, the feudal lord, probably a knight or baron, would be the maximum authority in your daily life. Owner of the lands where you worked, he would rarely interact directly with peasants, but his decisions would affect the entire community. A benevolent lord might reduce taxes in times of poor harvest, while a cruel one might demand payments even when famine threatened. In the 13th century, a typical lord like Sir Roger de Montfort, a hypothetical example, would have spent years in military campaigns and would see his lands primarily as a source of income to finance his social position and military obligations. More present in your day-to-day life would be the steward, reeve or bailiff, an administrator who represented the feudal lord in the village. Often a peasant who had risen to the position through his astuteness or loyalty, the steward supervised work on the lord's lands, collected taxes, and applied local justice. Someone like William Atter Wood might use his position to protect the village from excessive demands from the lord, or to enrich himself at the expense of other peasants. The parish priest would be a central figure in the community. Besides conducting masses and religious rituals, he often served as counselor, mediator of disputes, and, being one of the few literate people, helped with official documents. A priest like Father Thomas could be a truly devout and compassionate man, offering spiritual comfort and defending the poor. Or he could be corrupt, selling indulgences and living luxuriously while his parishioners starved. The midwife and healer was generally an older woman with knowledge of medicinal herbs and traditional practices passed down through generations. Someone like old Agnes would be responsible for assisting in childbirths, treating common injuries and illnesses, and preparing remedies from plants. Although her knowledge was limited by modern standards, it was often the only medical help available to peasants. However, these women lived under constant suspicion. A treatment that didn't work could easily lead to accusations of witchcraft. The village blacksmith occupied a unique social position as a skilled craftsman. He was one of the few peasants with a skill that guaranteed him a certain degree of independence and respect. Thomas the blacksmith would be responsible for making and repairing essential agricultural tools, horseshoes for animals, and occasionally simple weapons. The sound of his anvil was a constant part of the village's soundscape, and his workshop often served as an informal meeting point where news and rumors were exchanged. Children in the Middle Ages did not have the luxury of a prolonged childhood. Even small children, like young William, only 6 years old, would already have significant responsibilities, herding geese, collecting firewood, or helping in the fields during harvest. By around 7 years of age, many children were already working as adults, albeit with tasks adapted to their strength. Child mortality was devastating. In some communities, only half of the children reached 10 years of age. Peasant women, like Margaret the Weaver, faced a double workload. Besides helping in the fields during critical periods such as planting and harvesting, they were responsible for all domestic work: cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving. brewing beer, tending the garden, and raising children. Pregnancy and childbirth were moments of extreme danger, with maternal mortality rates close to 20%. A typical 13th century woman would have between 5 and 7 pregnancies during her life, lucky to see 3 or 4 children reach adulthood. The elderly, like old Robert, when they managed to reach this stage of life, something relatively rare, faced particular challenges. With bodies worn out by decades of exhausting physical work, they often suffered from debilitating arthritis, chronic respiratory problems, and malnutrition. In times of scarcity, older people sometimes chose to reduce their own food intake so that younger and more productive family members could survive. A silent and common sacrifice. Traveling merchants, like Jacques the Peddler, brought not only rare goods and news from the outside world, but also a breath of novelty to isolated communities. Their arrival was always an event, with peasants gathering to see their merchandise. Needles, combs, ribbons, simple spices, or even small mirrors, luxury items that most could only admire, rarely buy. These merchants also served as news bearers, connecting isolated communities to the wider world. Marginalized even within the already suffering peasant class, there were social outcasts. A leper like Simon the Marked would be forced to live outside the village, announcing his approach with a small bell so others could avoid him. Those considered simple, intellectually disabled, like Mary the Foolish, might be treated with a mixture of superstition and compassion. Some saw them as touched by God, others as possessed by evil spirits. The experience of different genders and social classes varied dramatically. A young peasant girl like Emma would be subject to arranged marriages, often still in adolescence, with little or no choice about her future. A runaway serf like John the Wanderer would live constantly in fear of being captured and severely punished. Having an ear cut off was a common punishment for runaway serfs on the first offense. The legacy of these medieval figures remains in our language, culture, and institutions. Many modern surnames derive from medieval occupations: smith, blacksmith, baker, miller. Festivals we celebrate today have roots in medieval peasant traditions. Even our concepts of work, time, and community were shaped by the experiences of these individuals who lived in conditions that today seem almost unimaginable. These characters, with their hopes, fears, and daily struggles, were not so different from us in their essential humanity. They just lived in a relentlessly harsher world. And it is precisely this hardness, this resilience necessary to simply exist day after day, that would be lacking in a modern person trying to survive as a medieval peasant, even for just 24 hours. After this imaginary journey through the life of a medieval peasant, I believe it has become quite clear why you, yes, you who are watching this video, probably wouldn't last 24 hours in this scenario. We, people of the 21st century, are conditioned by a life of relative comfort. Even those who consider themselves tough or adventurous by modern standards would hardly be prepared for the brutality of medieval daily life. It's not just a question of physical strength or practical skills, although most of us certainly lack both at the necessary level. It's also a question of psychological resistance to conditions that today we would consider unbearable. Recapping the main challenges you would face: exhausting physical work without proper tools, constant hunger and a diet severely deficient in nutrients, unsanitary conditions that would make your modern stomach turn, diseases without effective treatments, and an oppressive social structure that would drastically limit your life options. The Distance between our world and theirs is not just temporal, it's an abyss of human experience. Medieval peasants developed, over generations, a physical and mental resilience that we simply don't possess. They weren't superhuman. They were normal people, conditioned by a brutally different reality from ours. Ironically, these same peasants, whose lives seem so miserable by our standards, would probably consider us incredibly fragile and useless. Our inability to grow our own food, build shelter with materials available in nature, or survive without modern medicine would be as incomprehensible to them as their tolerance for pain and discomfort is to us. This leads us to an important reflection. Have we really evolved as much as we think? We've gained comfort, longevity, and freedoms, no doubt. But we've also lost basic survival skills that were essential for most of human history. The next time you watch a movie or series set in the Middle Ages, remember that reality was much harsher than any cinematic representation can capture. And perhaps, the next time you face a small modern inconvenience, like being without internet for a few hours, or having to wait in line at the supermarket, you might remember the medieval peasant and gain a bit of perspective. In the next episode, we'll explore another scenario where your chances of survival would be, well, let's say you shouldn't place bets on yourself. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, don't forget to leave a like, share with friends, and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.